Ja, Taudi Adnan for setting up. Shlome Kameto. And I would like to welcome everybody attending our today's session and presentation here online, but also those on Facebook, where our session is streamed live today. So our speaker today is the author of various scholarly publications related to Christian Islam relations and role of and contribution of Christians during the early Islamic era. It is with great pleasure that I would like to welcome Dr. Ashoor Yousif. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my privilege to be part of this platform and this gathering today.
We are honored, yeah. Dr. Ashoor Yousif is an Assyrian from Iraq who resides in Toronto and Canada. So prior we delve into the topic and presentation, I would like to introduce our today's speaker. Malfona Ashoor is Associate Professor of Christian History and Assistant Dean of the Tyndale Seminary at Tyndale University in Toronto, Canada, where he also serves as a member of the Board of Governors and a member of the Academic Senate of the university. His interdisciplinary research focused on the history of Middle Eastern Syria Christianity, particularly Christian-Muslim relations and Islamic religion and culture. His doctoral thesis, finalized in 2020, I guess, at the Department of Study of Religion of the University of Toronto, is titled God's Deputy and Christ Apostle, the Abbasid Caliph and the Christian Patriarch in Syriac and Arabic Christian Historiography. It examines the interaction of Muslim rulers and Christian clergies and the religion and political impact of Islam on the presence and status of the Christian communities within the Caliphate. Dr. Ashoor's teaching portfolio includes multiple universities and seminaries in Canada and Middle East. He has also published several articles and book chapters on these topics and speaks frequently at academic conferences in North America and Europe, respectively. He also serves as a member of the board of directors of the Canadian Society of Syriac Studies at the University of Toronto. Malfona Ashoor, I hope I haven't missed anything important.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. This is quite a bit of an introduction. I'm humbled by it.
You are welcome. So, in his presentation, Dr. Ashoor today will explore the fascinating and often overlooked dimension of history, the role of Christian people in the Middle East in shaping the intellectual and cultural achievements of the early Islamic world. As from the 7th to the 10th centuries, Christians were not only neighbors and participants in the daily life of the Caliphate, but also key transmitters of knowledge. Particularly important for us is to learn about the role of Syriac Christianity and Syriac Christians, which dominated much of the intellectual and religious landscape of the Near East and Mesopotamia at the emergence of Islam. But without further ado, I would like to hand over to Malfono Ashoor for his awaited presentation. Shano Malfono.
Shana, thank you. It's my privilege to be part of this platform, and I would be more than happy to share on this topic. I will put up a simple PowerPoint presentation to guide our thoughts. As it was introduced, I will start to talk about the contributions of Christians to the Arabic and Islamic civilization from the early Islam, but also will hint to some of the later contribution as further as to the 20th century. In summary, This presentation or this talk will cover a number of areas. It will be very difficult to cover all aspects of Christian contributions to over 1400 years in multiple areas. However, this is a summary and sampling of some of the most notable areas of contributions. It is coming from an article I wrote or a book chapters with the same titles in a book or edited volume on Islam, edited by Dr. Wajih Mikhail. So here is kind of the gist of that chapters, and I encourage anyone who's interested in further details of this topic to consult with the chapter in the book. In summary, I will cover 4 major areas of Christian participations. One is related to religion, and will touch different topics or areas of contributions, from sacred texts to theology and apologetics, to the practices, religious practices and ritual, to even the concept of religious language in some way. The second area that we will talk about is non-religious knowledge or other area of intellectual relationship, specifically in the fields of philosophy and medicine, which will dominate the Christian-Muslim relations and partnership and interaction, especially in the early few centuries of the rise of Islam. Then I will move to speak about cultural impact or contribution or influence, from hinting to things related to the Arabic language itself, some of the architectures of Islam, and even overall general areas of art. Finally, I'll talk a little bit about the Christians' participations in state politics or politics, administrations, and managing the affairs of the communities, and even international diplomacy. So as I said, this is kind of a survey, and there are certain areas where we will invest further time. And this, I have to clarify a few things. First, we will invest maybe more time in the early stages of Christian-Muslim relations. Secondly, we will talk about certain aspects like religions and knowledge and other areas more than state politics and things like that. Also, as was introduced, my area of focus is not comprehensive. I will not speak about all Christian denominations and traditions contribution, but most of my focus is on Syriac Christianity or Syriac-speaking Christians, although I will also talk about others like who comes from a different groups like Arabic-speaking Christians and alike. Okay, without further delay, we'll move into that. So Syriac Christianity, Syriac Christians, Arabic-speaking Christians affiliated with Syriac Christians were among the most influential people to shape Islam. And when I speak about Islam, I speak even from the perspective of religions. In fact, Christianity was present in the Middle East, dominated areas in the Fertile Crescents and such a reason, but also present in the peripheries of the Arabian Peninsula, either on its eastern shores or south, or in the areas between the Arabian Peninsula and the Fertile Crescent, the Northern deserts. In that context, Arab tribes, some of them were Christians and were influenced by Christianity, specifically in the form of Syriac Christianity. And this will start by talking how that meant it had the impact on the religion of Islam from beginning. If one examines the Quran, the Muslim scripture, find from beginning that there is a strong knowledge of Christians and Christianity, Christian scripture, creeds, liturgy, and even practices, and some expression of them. And in fact, when you read the Quran, it you can sense that there is in some way knowledge of Christianity, or the audience are aware of Christianity, and the Quran either affirms some aspect of it or challenge it theologically and doctrinally. And even in the language of the Quran, it's known that Syriac language and words are present in significant way. After the 7th century Islamic conquest of the Fertile Crescents, the Christian-Muslim interactions intensified and increased and led to a significant engagement between the two communities, discussing theology and Christian practices in polemic and apologetic languages. In such context, Christians responded to Islamic critique or Muslim critique of aspect of Christians' beliefs and practices, utilizing a long and rich history of apologetic skills coming from centuries of engagements in such a field. And we can see from earlier sources, earlier Syriac sources, accounts of debates between Christians and Muslims, significantly Christian clergies and monks and Muslims rulers. Later on, we start seeing Christians producing theological treatises in Syriac, Greek, and Arabic, engaging with key doctrines, Christian doctrines, such as Trinity and Christ Christology, and critique for Islam. In this Christian-Muslim theological engagement, Christian challenged also some Muslims' belief and practices. And those two aspects, Christian defending their faith and challenging Muslims' faith, led and put a demands on Muslims to respond to that in ways that led to them defining and refining some of their theological belief and even method of expressing their belief, leading to formulations of some of the Islamic views, but also Islamic schools of theologies, the most noticeable the Mu'tazilats in the 8th and 9th century. Also, Christian response to Muslims' critique utilized some well-developed Christian apologetics argument and modes of debate that utilize Greek rational philosophical arguments. Muslims became familiar with these tools and adapted them in their own theological internal debates and with Christians, developing eventually works or the disciplines of the Ilm al-Kalam or philosophical theology or of Islam. And with time, Muslims start themselves writing works, polemic works against Christians in the 9th to the 11th century. Hence, Christians introduced to the Muslims tools and methods of how to think theologically and defend the theology, and that produced some of the diverse schools within Islam and that engage with Islamic theology, either using or refusing the use of, for example, rational Greek philosophy. Beyond that, we see that some of the early Christians' practices, dominant practices, might also had an impact on Islam religious practices. For example, we see that Christians were familiar with some of the practices like prayer styles, especially among the Desert Fathers and monks, in which bowing and prostrations resembled maybe what we can see in Islam from the concept of sujood or rak'ah. Oriental Christians of the regions also had canonical hours of prayers, dividing the days to different fixed times of prayers, which we see something similar in Islam in the concept of the 5 times of prayers. And that might mean there might be some influence there. Christians also, Eastern Christians, tend to have a direction of prayer toward the east, and Muslims later on have this concept also of having a qibla or a directions of prayer. Maybe even the area of fasting might see resemblance. The concept of annual Ramadan fasting might comes from some of early Christian annual fasting, such as the Lent. Terms and languages in their concepts like both the Islamic jihad and shahada might connected with the Christian concept of martyrdom, in which both the struggles for God or dying for God while witnessing and or promoting the faith is connected. Specifically, if we recall, and many of you know, that in Syriac term, the term for martyrdom and witnessing is sahduta, which is connected by this term of shahada that we see in Islam. Other terms are there, the concept of salat or sluta, prayers, عبادة أو عبادة, worship, قريانة or qaraya, furqan, and even things like this. Some even argues that the Islamic statement of confession, the basmala, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate, could be associated with the Syriac basmala in some way, Shemit Rahman Rahima, in the name of God, the merciful and the beloved. So religiously, the interaction between Christians and Muslim have shaped or influenced or drove the Muslims to think theologically and maybe practice their faith in some ways that it intersect with Christianity and the belief and practice and the thoughts of Christians. Beyond this, we also can speak of Christian contributing to the Islamic knowledge beyond the religious aspect, if we want to talk about intellectual contributions in other areas. And Christians had long history of engagement with these disciplines, from medicine to philosophy to astronomy, logic, mathematics, astrologies, and other aspects in late antiquity and early medieval knowledge. And Christians at the coming of Islam were well equipped and well knowledgeable in these fields, and that set them in a way to be contributors to the development of an Islamic intellectual civilization, especially during the golden age of Islamic civilization in the early Abbasid period between the 8th and the 10th century. The most significant contribution in that area is the question of transmitting foreign knowledge, if we want, and translating it, specifically the Greek intellectual history and the transmissions and translation movements that happened during the 8th to the 10th century. Greek work, but also Syriac work built on Greek sources. And also we find Pahlavi, Persian sources, and Sanskrit, Hindu works from both the Hellenistic and the Persian worlds were translated either directly into Arabic or through Syriac intermediary by leading Christian scholars. The movement brought diverse knowledge to the Islamic context. This is not something that launched from beginning with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. While Christians were interested in these areas and engaged with it, the early Muslims were less involved in that interest. However, slowly Muslims, especially under the Umayyads, start investing in collecting foreign knowledge, without, of course, at the beginning establishing any systematic translations project like the one we see with the Abbasid. They worked on acquiring knowledge from the Byzantine Greek context in areas of state administration, bureaucracy, politics, and commerce. And early Christians were contributing to this, and we'll talk about that, either working as a statespeople or bringing that knowledge to the Islamic Caliphate. With the rise of the Abbasid in the 750 and the establishment of Baghdad a decade later, the intellectual center drifted in that directions, and the East Syriac living in the Mesopotamia region of modern-day Iraq, where part of the center of the Abbasids, will become a major influential in shaping that intellectual project. They would play a prominent role in that context, and as was noted, unfortunately, many times that is not recognized. And when it's recognized, unfortunately, it's often recognized as them being purely hired service of the Muslim's patron to translate and transmit this knowledge, without recognizing that they were, many of them, practitioners, teachers, partners, and authors, basically thinkers in that field. We sufficient to highlight some comments about the fields of medicine and philosophy. Some of you are familiar that during the early Abbasids, often Christians, specifically Syriac Christians, served as physicians of the caliph and later on sultans and viziers and governments, and also established medical centers. One can speak about early hospitals and schools, and translated medical work and authored medical works. And we are familiar with some of those people, the most notably the Ashoor family that served 8 generations for over 250 years. In the field of philosophy, Christians also not only translated and transmitted Greek philosophy, but many of them were philosophers who thought, wrote commentary on Greek works, and also produced their own works. And the list is long of such thinkers from the 8th century and all the way to the 13th centuries. In such context, Christians worked closely with Muslims and influenced Muslim thinkers, creating a form of partnership, of relationship, and communities or gathering of communities of different religious background in this common project and interest, discussing important topics related to politics, life, and many aspects of good citizenship, from the ideas of good life to moralities to virtues. The Christian thinkers were interested in ethics, morality, politics, as I said, and wrote about them. They wrote about concepts like sadness, happiness, vices, virtues, societal goodness, good governance, harmony and relation between different religions in that context. And this will continue and influence the situation in a way that some of these thought later on will influence other Christians during the what is known the Arabic Nahda or awakening in the 19th and 20th century, where a Christian comes back and write about these philosophical topic. In that context, many of the Muslim scholars, from the Kindi to Razi, Al-Farabi, were both students, colleagues, and teachers of Christians once. And often that they joined and worked together in many aspects. During the later period, including the 12th to the 13th century, known as the late Syriac Renaissance, we see other individuals participating in that context up to, let's say, the 13th, 14th century. Eventually, both Islamic intellectualism and civilization start declining by the 13th, 14th century, especially after a period of chaos and the Mongols' invasion, which not only impacted the Islamic Caliphate, but the Christian populations, reducing it and almost eradicating Christian presence in some places throughout Asia, and reducing the population in the Middle East to a minority. Regardless, we find the legacy of some of those Christian thinkers and Islamic historians, especially those historians interested in science and philosophy. Beyond this context, we can speak also of Christian contribution to the overall, if we want to say, culture of the Arabic Islamic culture. And I will highlight few areas that one can notice of examples and see of a Christian influence. One area is the issue of language and specifically script. Pre-Islamic and post-conquest Arab Christian have contributed to the Arabic linguistic culture through developing, possibly, or helping in developing an Arabic script influenced by potentially Syriac script in the context of the Aramaic or Syriac scripts in the works with Arabs such as the Nabateans or the Lakhmids of Hira. Also, we can see that in pre-Islam and in early Islam, the presence of some famous Christian poets who wrote Arabic poetries or composed or produced Arabic poetry, often in oral traditions. And we see that some of those authors and poets were influenced by some Christian's motif, either were biblical or from the daily life. Themes related to creations and the flood, day of judgment and the day of resurrections that often Christian ascetics and monks spoke about are displayed in some of this early pre-Islamic and early Islamic poetry. Also, we might speak about some of the Christians' motif appearing in Islamic thinking, including in some of the Sufi or ascetic Islam Sufis. There is engagement with themes like love and mercy, kindness, devotion, and purity of heart, and some of the language and teaching of Jesus, such as the Sermon on the Mountain. Even in many Islamic works, we find this concept of an Islamic Jesus or an Islamic monks, basically collections of sayings attributed to Jesus or Christian monks that are endorsed by Islamic asceticism and Sufism. The Christian contribution to this culture movement probably, as I said, declined with time, but one cannot ignore the later contribution of Christians to Arabic Islamic culture during what's known as the Arabic Renaissance or the Nahda in the 19th and 20th century. And here we can point briefly to some of the areas such as Christians produced or contributed to bringing technologies into the Middle East, such as the printing press. Some of the earliest printing press established in the Middle East between the 16th and 19th century were associated with Christian churches and traditions, from Malkite to Maronites to other Armenians, and we find them establishing printing press throughout the Levant area, Iraq, and Egypt. This also intrigued some later Muslims to produce or establish printing press invested in printing material related to Islam in that context. Christians were also some of the pioneers in establishing magazines and newspapers in the area of Arab journalism from the 19th centuries and beyond. Some of the earliest and most famous newspapers and magazines in Egypt and the Levant area were established and led by Christian thinkers. And in the area of education, Christian missionaries, Western missionaries, were important in establishing some of the early Christian schools, universities, such as the American universities of Beirut or Cairo, or the Baghdad College, Al Hikmah College, and other ones. We also see in this later period Christian being involved in theater and drama and alike. In the field of culture, if we speak, and especially in the area of architecture, sorry, apologies, we see that from beginning, Christians, architects, craftsmen, and artists had impact in shaping Islamic civilizations in many ways, specifically even in developing or building or inspiring Islamic religious buildings such as mosques. Some of the earliest Islamic works, including mosque in the Levant regions, for example, are influenced by imitating some of the Christian churches or cathedrals in that regions. Even later, during the Ottomans period, many of the mosques that we see in modern-day Istanbul, Constantinople, are similar or shaped or influenced by Byzantine designs of churches in that context. Not only Christians' religious sites, churches, and shrines influenced the Muslims, sometimes they were directly transformed, in a sense, where Christian churches were transformed to mosque, and we see the Christian basically architects and style in that space from the most famous, as we know, the Hagia Sophia cathedral that became a mosque. We know that Islam does not have rich heritage of iconography due to a religious position on that matters, but sometimes we can see some depictions of Islamic art that has similarity with Christianity, including depiction of biblical scenes and some of that aspect. Beyond that, and I will highlight briefly some of the Christian contributions to the area of politics. And here I want to say is that when the early Muslims came to the different regions of Mesopotamia and the Levant, the Fertile Crescent, and Egypt, the administrations of the states were almost left intact in the hand of the local administrators. Muslims were more concerned with establishing, if you want, called law and order, and in some sense controlling militarily those regions, but running the states itself was left in the hands of the existing administrators. And most of those existing administrators, or a big number of those existing administrators, were Christian, especially within the context of the Byzantine Empire. And those people continue serving in that capacity, running the state's affair from that perspective. The most notable are the Mansour's family, and later on others, in the Umayyad period, and also some continue later on in the Abbasid and even the Fatimids of Egypt, or the Mamluk also. Even during the Ottoman Empire, skilled Greek Christians were utilized in running the affairs and participate in governing the empire in some way, and played a role in, for example, running some of the administration's aspect of the state. Christians were also used, and especially the religious leadership, the patriarchs, in managing some of the internal affairs of the society or the caliphate, especially in relations to managing the affairs of the Christian groups and minorities. Patriarchs were often the civil servants of the states of the caliphate who were responsible about administrating the will of the states or the caliphate within the context of their communities. And also often they were the mediators or the representatives of the Christian community in the states in front of the caliph and in the royal court. Finally, I want to say that Christians were also involved in the area of international diplomacy, something that is noticeable even before the rise of Islam. During the Persian, Roman, Byzantine relations in late antiquity, often Christian clergies, patriarchs, and bishops served as ambassadors who traveled between those two empires to manage affairs of the relation between their either negotiation peace treaty during the war or prisoner swaps or even trade exchange. When the Muslims came, continue such a role in some capacity, and sometimes we find them sending Christians, religious clergies, patriarchs, and bishops to the Byzantine context. Even the Umayyads themselves in their relations with the European context, the medieval European kingdoms, use some of their Christian population, often the clergy in that level. As late as the 20th century, 19th century, Christians were once again involved in the affairs of their worlds, especially during the rise of if we want to talk Arab nationalism, and we find some Christians writing against Turkish occupations, contributing to the Arab nationalistic thoughts and the idea of Arabism, nationalism as a source of union between the different religious groups, including Christian, and some of them became an important players even in establishing political parties in that context. So if in conclusions, we can see that Christians influenced and contributed to the Arabic Islamic civilization from the moment, even one speak pre-Islam, to the rise of Islam, to the late medieval period, and as early as as late as the modern era, including in different contexts in the areas of religions, knowledge, cultures, and politics. Throughout their histories within the Arab Islamic world, Christians were scholars, physicians, scientists, philosophers, teachers, authors, poets, scribes, translators, journalists, administrators, politicians, and sometimes ambassadors and statesmen. This rich and long legacy is known to many scholars and specialists, yet unfortunately sometimes is not known to the general public, and sometimes it's even missed in writings about Arabic and Islamic civilization's history. Thank you very much for allowing me to share this summary and brief survey of this long and rich history of Christian contributions to the Arab and Islamic civilization.
Yeah, thank you very much. Wonderful presentation. You draw a huge arc, time-wise from over multiple centuries until recent time. Particularly, you delved into many areas that were not known to be the field where Christians contributed to Islamic civilization. And I think generally when you speak of early Islamic era, people might know about translations and medicine, but not much more. And so you have touched upon very, very important topics. let's see if we have our administrator Adnan told me that we have about 60 viewers on Facebook, and but so far I haven't seen any question from there. That's what he's saying. So let me or let go forward with a couple questions which I try to formulate while you were speaking. So first of all, what motivated Christians in general to participate so actively in this translation or transition movement generally, be it translation, be it medical? Was it just primarily religious, cultural, or more practical approach?
Yeah, they've been doing this in a sense. This is not something the coming of Islam initiated. Christians were administrator of the state, for example, and participated in the affair of states. Part of in the Byzantine context, you might assume that because the Byzantine were Christians, but I'm talking specifically even about local Christians were participating in tax collection, running the accounts of the states and things like that. Christians were very much interested in intellectual knowledge that served the community, from medicine. They were interested in Greek. The early interest in Greek intellectualism started religiously, and from the religious interest in, and I'm talking about Middle Eastern Christianity or Syriac Christianity, from interest in early church fathers, being Greek fathers, in the interest in the Bible, be in the New Testaments, being in Greek and translating this, but also in back and forth interactions and in the other fields, bringing knowledge. The early Greek fathers utilized some of the Greek intellectualism in Christian apologetics. We know that from the 2nd, 3rd century, Christian apologetics in dealing with Greek polytheists used Greek philosophy and knowledge in debates and apologetics. And the Syriac Christians and other Christians in the regions inherited that culture and find it valuable. And so from their daily life and jobs, if you want, to their religious interest, to their intellectual curiosity, we find them, when Islam comes, almost there is a continuations. The only thing happen is that if we want to say, the political leadership and the new developed culture is a bit new, and the Christian infused in it many elements of the past and shaped it. So the Arab Islamic cultures of the region is not the Nicene Arab culture of the Arabian Peninsula. When it came to this region, it was shaped by the Aramaic, Syriac, Coptic, and all of those elements, culturally, religiously, intellectually, in some way. So the motivation is, in my say, is this continuation of what they do. If one look at my articles in detail, find, for example, in the area of medicines, Christians were doctors and interested in medicine and science in the 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, within the Persian context or the Byzantine context. So when the Muslims came, they continue becoming interested, and they continue to be doctors and thinkers, and many of the translations movement to Arabic in the first stage were translated in Greek works that already been translated to Syriac because the Syriac-speaking people were interested in it.
Okay. You mentioned, of course, Coptic. Then we have the Syriac in Mesopotamia and in Persia and Armenian. Were there differences in regional transmission activity, or would you say there was one center and periphery, or how was it?
It's very, of course, the transmission of knowledge overall is too big an area. I don't even have a full grasp on it. But what I tied it with when I tied it with Islam and the Islamic civilization, the centers were always where the Islamic center is. So the first century, we might see significant work within the Damascus, Levant area under the Umayyad. Then Baghdad rises to become the centers. Then with Baghdad not disappearing completely, but other centers rising in the Andalusia and in Spain, among the Umayyads there, or in Egypt, the Fatimids, then the Ayyubids and the Mamluk, wherever the center that define Islamic culture, Arabic Islamic culture and knowledge, there were Christians there contributing in some way. So if one need to trace that, we'll find, for example, there is more significant contributions of Christians in the 8th, 9th century in Baghdad to the 10th century, but then Christians in Egypt and then in the Andalusia in Spain. So that's its movement, because they were in the center of knowledge and civilization, and the Islamic patronage was important in that.
So how, to what extent did the translation of Greek philosophical text by Syria Christian shape the Islamic theology or philosophy? Was it just for the apologetic methodology, or was it much more deep into the theology, Islamic theology?
There is both, definitely, and the people who are familiar with Islamic thoughts are aware that especially during the 8th, 9th century, an important Islamic school of theology developed called the Mu'tazila. And the Mu'tazila were very rationalistic in a sense. They use reasons and rational thinking, not for apologetic purposes, for actually to think about Islam, driven by the absolute monotheism, the concept of Tawheed, which they adhere to it, led for them to develop some thoughts that even later on became heretics. The most noticeable things, they developed this idea that the Quran is created or is not eternal. There's quite a bit of debates in Islam, and that for a period of time, Muslims, caliphs such as Al-Ma'mun, adopted that school of thinking about the doctrine of scripture, or the doctrine of Quran, if we want to. And that's he engaged in level of enforcing that, sometimes known in Arabic as al-Mihna, or the Inquisition, if you want, where Muslims, judges or rulers, religious scholars, were forced to accept that or examine to see if they accept that doctrine or not. Eventually, al-Mihna will stop, and this school of theology about the Quran will disappear in some way, and the Muslim will fault or will adopt that the Quran is eternal, which is the dominant things. But you can see, for example, how that the Christian thinking rationally about Christian doctrines might also impacted the Muslim thinking rationally about their doctrines of God and the scripture.
Yeah, my next question was actually, how did Syria Christian physicians and scientists earn the position of trust and prestige in the Muslim court despite religious differences? But you answered the question in your previous answer, saying that Christians were already established, were administrators, were on all level of the society, on a high level of education and teaching, so that Arabs basically, when they came into the region, they utilized this knowledge.
Yeah, there was a need and a supply. The Christians were capable, they were there, and the Muslims needed that. The Ashoor family that was brought all the way from further in Asia and Iran, and were well established Christian physicians. There was a school of medicine there, and the Abbasids, known for their association further east rather than in the Arab worlds, in the areas of Iran and Afghanistan, they were probably familiar with that. So when they established their center in Baghdad, as early as Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, and the second caliph, he invited the first of the Ashoor to be his physicians. And that practice continued for 8 generations, as far as about 250 years. And others of the same schools, many of them brought from that schools, and later on, more physicians actually were studied and developed within the Iraqi context, and they were native to that region in some way.
So, how long did it go that this transition, let me say, became or was inflected with tensions or limitations, and wasn't so free as in the early phase of the Islam?
Yeah, and I think this is as to what I highlighted earlier about the Mu'tazila. Give us a hint with the penetrations of approaching religions rationally or through reasons and logic rather than scripturally or literally, created a tension within Islam about the place and value of philosophy. I'll put a side notes to this. This is not something new. Actually, if you read early Christians' engagement with Greek philosophy and rationalism, there is this famous saying by Tertullians, church fathers, Latin church fathers from the 3rd century. He said, what the church has to do with academia, what Jerusalem had to do with Athens. And he critiqued some of the church fathers utilizing Greek knowledge, philosophy, and concept of truth in their understanding and defining and defending Christian faith. And something similar happened in Islam between what we call later I can call Sunni or scripturalist and rationalists like the Mu'tazila. So when that started appearing in the 9th century and early 20th century, a general negative attitude against philosophy and philosophers start developing in that context. And in fact, we find partnership between Christian philosophers and Muslim philosophers defending philosophy and this knowledge in the face of more traditional Muslim critique of that body of knowledge. And that appears specifically in the 10th century strongly. By the 11th century, Islamic Sunnism or traditionalism will dominate, and the Muslims will continue to struggle with that. You have both in the later between the Ghazali and Razi, between the Razi, Farabi, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd, this struggle. But by late time, the Christians are less of an influencers, and actually they start being influenced. One of the most famous Christian thinker, Gregory Bar-Hebraeus, Ibn al-Ibri, is influenced by later Muslim philosophers, and they agree in so many things, but both of them are challenged by traditionalist Islam or Muslims.
Interestingly, you pointed to influence in both sides. It had also Christianity during the early phase of Islam, and when the apologetic, let me say, concepts were developed, they had also to adapt. So what kind of adaptation happened on the Christian side because of the Muslim? Because until that time, Christians were just arguing within their own confession theologically They were very well versed, of course, but only not on the principal issues of Christianity. Now there was a religion which probably questioned the very principal issues of Christianity. So what kind of changes were adapted?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very important and big topic that many scholars wrote about it, and outside the scope of this article. But briefly, I say definitely, as you said, Christians, rather than being engaged with each others in the area of their differences, which is well known for where that came from the Christological controversies of the 5th centuries and beyond. They find that there is a critique, in, as you said, in the core ideas of how they understand God, the concept of Trinity, the divinity of Christ. So, two things I can highlight briefly. One is that the Christians start writing with the Muslim critique and Muslim minds in front of them. Not because they are writing to the Muslims directly, but even if they're writing among themselves for training themselves and developing their students. Theodore Barconi's write Scholians, basically a training guide to students, East Syriac students, and he's very much engaged with Muslims' critique, developing theologians thinking about their faith with the Muslims' interlocutor. The second things will happen is that, and that happened twice in the Syriac context in two different ways. Some of the Syriac terminology, theological terminology, were shaped by Greek language. We can see adaptation of a Greek language terminology in Syriac language during the late antiquity, the patristic fathers. What we see here is that Christians, Syriac theologians, developing Arabic terminology for their theology. Concepts like Trinity, Thaluth in Arabic, or other, and Nasud, and other things. And that will develop eventually to create what we can call Arabic Christianity or Arabic language Christianity, which until the 8th century was almost non-existent. But with the rise of Islam and the context of Islam, and with Muslims as interlocutor, Christians develop a language for their faith. So both concepts were shaped of how I think about my faith with such a challenge or critique of Muslim, and second things, how I communicate that to an audience who speak Arabic or think in Arabic terminology.
Interesting. So how did this role of Christians contributing to the Islamic society civilization evolved between the Umayyad and the Abbasid Caliphate? Were there any differences in adapting or being open to it?
Yeah. So the Umayyads, we have to recognize that the Umayyads, being almost the first century of Islam, was less interested in, or at least we don't have enough sources to think about that. We don't have many Islamic sources discussing religions and theology. What we see is that the Umayyads were more of statesmen or rulers. Sometime the critique later on in historian, they called Arab kings rather than Muslim caliphs, because they were more like statesmen and kings and rulers. So the Christian contributions in that area were in that field. They are more interested in tax system and state administrations and things like that, and scribes, and that's the contributions of like the Mansour families and others. With the Abbasid comings, we recognize a more religious dynasty, or although not in function but in ideology. The Abbasid came more on the, rather than with them, if we want to distinguish them, and I know that's generalization, rather than focusing on being an Arab kingdom is an Islamic caliphate. With that, the Abbasid start becoming more interested in religiosity, or within the Islamic Abbasid context, religion prominence. That's the reason we see way more, for example, in my opinion, Christian Muslim religious dialogues and texts and writings by Christians and Muslims. So that the second things, the Abbasid were more open to others, just out of the influence of the presence of what other elements, non-Arab elements, like the Persians and others, who both Persians' model of states was more interested to them. I have to highlight this. The Umayyads were very much, if we want to generalize it, the Umayyad Caliphate was built on a Byzantine models of states, whereas the Abbasid built a model similar to the Persian model of an empire or states. So we start seeing a shift where actually during the Abbasid, the Christian as a statesman declined and the Persian as a statesman increased. The Persian elements in the Abbasid were more in the places of scribes and administrators and governors. So the Christian focused on or continue contributing in the other areas such as knowledge, medicine, philosophy, and religion.
Thank you. You mentioned, of course, how this knowledge, be it the philosophy or medical knowledge, received Spain, yeah, and
Yes.
the translation was done into European languages. Is the impact or contribution of figures like Hunayn ibn Ishaq or later, was this acknowledged in the European, let me say, academia back then and today?
Yeah, less. It's not that obvious, because what happened is that this Christian thinking and writing and translating was observed by the Muslims, and Muslims didn't receive it and transmit it statically to the European. We know that Islamic philosophy, medicines, and other knowledge developed by Muslims in the first few centuries of the second millennium. So people like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina and others wrote their own works. And it's based on Christians, but hasn't been basically, it's not transmitting of Christians completely. So when the European received that, they received it more as an Islamic knowledge or an Islamic work. So we have less of that, although there are some hints and some notes of some thinkers, but often we're lump sum in the umbrella of Arab kind of thinkers, not specifically Christian versus Muslim, the Arabic civilization, or coming from the worlds of Arabs. But in medieval time, these names are not as known as in modern reality in Western Europe.
So, in summary, could you pointed to the golden age of Islam? In summary, could the Islamic golden age have developed in the same way without the intellectual mediation and transition by Christians?
This is a question of guessing or educated guess. I think, and maybe I will be biased, I think we'll say no, because you need the mediators in any civilization developments. You need some mediators, either mediators who are within your context or from outside. and we see that later on. I think one can speak about, when we speak about modern rise of the Middle East, was influenced by either Christian coming from the West or some Middle Eastern going to the West. So you need that. So in the early Islam, I think the advantage Muslim had, and early Islamic civilization had, that among them there were enough knowledge and knowledgeable people and intellectual that it developed within rather than seeking it externally. Although we have enough evidence of some of the Muslim caliphs like Al-Ma'mun and Al-Rashid writing to the Byzantines emperor requesting manuscripts of Greek knowledge and things. But most likely that request was a second phase after them finding or knowing about this. And most likely they knew about that from the Christian with among themselves. Wasn't because they were encountering Greek Byzantine intellectual on the borders or something like that.
Interestingly, in one of the categories you listed and elaborated about, there was influence on language and poetry. So even until the late centuries in 15th, 16th century, there was a debate, or let me say, Arabic language regarded itself as superior, of course, in poetry, and as a reaction, BarAbraham, I think, countered this. There is at least some references that it was on a provocation he got from Arab writers. He wrote his book Ferdeysa Dedan.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. We had a lecture about this with Dr. Helen recently here on this
Yeah, a couple of months
forum.
ago, I noticed. Yes, correct.
Yeah, wonderful. So actually, I need to ask Adnan if we have any question on. As he says, our audience has probably is not fully English in following, but you cannot formulate probably questions. But we had about 60, or we have about 60 viewers currently, and this is recorded. I think we have captured it. We have quite a bit beyond 1 hour that we targeted for this lecture. Thank you very, very much for your preparation. I think all categories deserve to be delved into a separate, let me say, presentation. I didn't know that there are in so many areas there was contributions as you have listed. But as I said, you have drawn a huge arc time-wise, and it deserves probably. Is there actually any book that covers all this topic currently, or do you plan any book on this? I mean, you have probably drafted a skeleton currently of such a book.
Yeah, that will be a beautiful big project. If you look at my articles in my chapter, you'll see an extensive bibliography and footnotes, because we're talking about different disciplines from all over the places and beyond. So if anyone wants to is interested in this, I desired in my chapters to provide significant footnotes to sources on these, and maybe individuals need to look into specific sources and that are noted in the footnotes and bibliography. But I am not aware, and I might be mistaken, I'm not aware of a book that cover all these in some way. There are works done on Christian contributions into early Islam or the Golden Age, definitely. There is, as you said, strong focus on the area of translations and transmission of Greco-Roman intellectuals, Hellenistic philosophy. There is quite a bit of writing on that, but maybe less on the other areas.
Okay. So in summary, you have the last word to, let me say, conclude the session. If you want to add anything else, please go ahead.
Yeah, I will start by thanking you and the platform and all the audience to give me this chance to share about what I think is very important history. And it's very important history to highlight, to show the potentials of how people of a different religions and backgrounds can still work. The West, if I want to say, in recent centuries and decades, celebrate and compliment themselves on this idea of multiculturalism and people coming from different culture and religions to build a civilization or to build the future. And one encountered this in the context of the Middle East way earlier, and see how Christians were always willing and impactful in shaping the context they live in. And I will encourage also people like myself and many like you who are in diaspora in different contexts to still think like this. How can I not only benefit from the space and the reality I am in, but how actually I contribute to it, to its civilizations, to its people, to its knowledge, to its progress, learning from our ancestors who, even in harder and more challenging settings, they were impactful.
Wonderful lesson that you are advising here. And I hope it's not the first or last session that we will have, because there are many topics you addressed, of course, in other papers you have written academically, and also on the topics of your thesis, PhD thesis. And I hope we will see each again. I would like to thank you very, very much again for your effort, for your presentation, and wish you all the best and success.
Thank you very much. Bafshana, Basi Maraba.